Ultima Thule, a pocket of reality carved from the void of space with Dynamis, where the ghosts of long-dead civilizations still wander. But this impossible world in the void of space on the edge of the universe raises so many questions about the world of Final Fantasy XIV. If you're wondering why there are stars in all directions on the edge, it's because space in 14 is curved. That's a non-canonical explanation for the business decision to make a skybox that can be turned any which way, but it fits for now, so I'm sticking with that. After leaving our tiny world of Aetheris for the first, and then entirely for the Sea of Stars, we find ourselves bombarded with an enormous amount of information, much of which we are asked to take on faith. But I don't take anything on faith, so let's ruin this miracle with facts and logic. We know that Dynamis is manipulated by the power of emotions, and the environment in Ultima Thule was partially formed by the emotions of the Scions when they sacrificed themselves, which allowed our alien ether forms to survive in a swirling maelstrom of emotions in space. But the emotions that were there to shape Ultima Thule to begin with were the emotions of the now dead civilizations, emotions experienced by Medion as her own due to her empathic nature. This is important, so remember it. Medion drew her own conclusions from those emotions born from both her lack of worldly experience, since Hermes effectively said he didn't want to raise her, and foisted that job on literally everyone else, of which there were exactly 0 takers. Anyway, these conclusions neumed straight to the end of everything, and she wound up genociding and permakilling most of life in the universe. That which the Great Filter didn't filter out got dark forested by the Matea. Yes, Medion drew her own conclusions from those emotions, but Medion's lack of experience also left her utterly unprepared to deal with the emotions she encountered in the universe. The pain of loss of the Corellians, the utter despair of the Grebulov, or the resignation of the Ea. All of these manifested in Ultima Thule and the Dead Ends, which is part of Ultima Thule and will be included when I mention Ultima Thule, for reference. But not exactly as they were, but as Medion interpreted them. She absorbed the emotions she felt from the races she visited, and in Ultima Thule, those emotions became manifest through the power of Dynamis. But again, while these emotions were the ones taken from the now dead worlds, they were manifested by Medion, not the now extinct races she met along the way. So what we essentially have in Ultima Thule is a Dynamis copy of the emotions Medion experienced in her travels. A second-hand account, rather, of the real thing. If it helps, we've encountered this before in Emet-Selch's recreated Amarot. The similarities are actually striking, where Amarot is a recreation born from ether and populated by the shades of the long dead. Ultima Thule is a recreation born of Dynamis and populated by the emotional afterimages of the long dead. But are these emotional afterimages actually alive? Jammingway argues that they are. I argue that they are not. Ultimately, it broaches on one of the many issues that Endwalker swan dives into. This one topic is prevalent throughout all of Endwalker, but particularly in Elpis. What is life? The scientific definition of life is generally an organism that has capacity for growth, reacts to stimuli, uses chemical reactions to create energy, uses that energy to carry out biological processes, and can reproduce. But even then, the world has myriad definitions of what constitutes life, including philosophical viewpoints as varied as the stars in the sky as to when it begins and ends. Yes, Endwalker dove into this topic quite heavily. When we arrive in Elpis, one of the first things we are asked to do is kill some butterflies to harvest their ether and make some robes. The quest is given by Hythlodaeus, who thinks nothing of it. After all, they aren't really alive, they're just ether someone shaped into an organic shell that can move independently. The ancients seem to regard life as something that possesses a soul. If there were no soul, then it was not alive. Hermes disagreed with this view, which gave rise to his silent and then very loud rebellion. But this is a viewpoint held by most ancients that we encounter. Emmett Selk revealed much during Shadowbringers.
I do not consider you to be truly alive, ergo I will not be guilty of murder if I kill you.
So it stands to reason that even though humanity as it exists after the Sundering possesses souls, due to their incomplete nature, the ancients would not have regarded them as true souls, and therefore not alive. When we are in Elpis, we are commonly regarded as a familiar, albeit a very strange one. We are recognized to have a soul, and are viewed as something of a curiosity explained away by our belonging to Azem, which I assume also explains everyone's reactions to the Warrior of Light's very strange aether pattern. It's possible that Emmett Selk simply attributed the sundered souls to the Sundering, which would invoke millennia of emotional trauma after having lost his entire species and being forced to watch them reduced to barely cognizant Neanderthals incapable of even speaking. But I think it more likely that he and other ancients would have viewed sundered humanity as an oddity at best, or a failed creation at worst. Elpis was a testing ground for creations before they were to be introduced into the world. Their worth to the benefit of the star determined whether they would be allowed to survive in the world writ large. But we see the dark side of the blissful utopia here. The animals in Elpis know fear of death and live terrified that each day could be their last. Hermes saw this as a cruel fate. Crueler still when they eradicate entire species for being deemed unworthy of life on the star and unworthy of further study. It could be argued that by bringing life into the world, the ancients who created these creatures should be responsible for protecting and developing that life. We see this with the Charybdis, but we also see the callousness with which the ancients treat the creatures in Elpis. To the ancients, they are nothing more than tools and property, a resource to be utilized for their own ends. We can't be sure who made the butterflies we murdered, but we can be sure that Hythlodaeus requested they be killed with the casualness of ordering food at a drive-thru. Okay, maybe not that far, but it's emblematic of the ancient perspective of what life is, and how something that we as the player would consider to be alive and have seen in the world we play in are given no more consideration than would a commodity in the real world. The ancients can create life from essentially nothing, and with that same ease remove it, regardless of the will of the living being. Endwalker goes to the other extreme once we reach Ultima Thule, showing us beings utterly unlike anything we have ever known made of Dynamis. These creatures were formed from the memories of ancient civilizations, and the Dynamis formed into a livable atmosphere through Thancred and the other Scions' will for the others to survive. But these creatures that blinked into existence don't meet the criteria for life as we know it. Do they possess souls? Souls as we know them are comprised of ether, so it would be unlikely. Therefore, by the ancient standards, they would not be considered alive. Additionally, Dynamis is fluid and very influenced by the emotional state of an area. But Dynamis requires a source of emotion in order to react, but this fluid power is still being affected. Jammingway attributes this to the beings that live there, but we saw at the end of Endwalker that Medion sang her song of hope before she died, infusing Ultima Thule with her hope that life would fill the universe again. Unfortunately, etheric life is unable to spring forth from Dynamis as far as we know, but I interpreted it initially that she was going to use Dynamis to influence the aether of dead worlds to spring forth life again. However, this could have too many variables, and wouldn't guarantee that the life of those worlds would be the same life that used to live there. In fact, it almost assuredly wouldn't. But Medion already had a menagerie of races long dead. While what we experience in Ultima Thule at the beginning may have only been the ambient Dynamis echoes of emotion and memories left behind at the twilight of each race, Medion's overwhelming emotions of hope at the end could and would have affected it. But would it have been enough to call it life? During the Omicron Gathering quests, we get to know each of the races we met in Ultima Thule a bit better. I had a major concern regarding these Dynamis entities though. If Aether displaces Dynamis, then would these entities be able to exist in an ether-rich environment, or would they dissipate into their base Dynamis components? Fortunately, we got an answer to this when we visit Vidofnir with Jammingway and N7000. As N7000 is a being made of pure Dynamis, this was an excellent opportunity to explore this concern. While I understood that due to the constraints of the game engine and in order to limit the scope of the quests, N7000 would likely be fine, there was a small itch in my brain. What if it did disappear? It didn't, of course, which blew a giant hole in my theory. Now, the Dynamis entities could exist just fine in aether-rich environments. This means that, in-universe, they weren't trapped in the Dynamis-rich domain of Ultima Thule, or even open space. But they could return to their now dead worlds, littered with the 12,000-year-old ruins of what they used to be, and rebuild their societies. The universe could once again be filled with life. But we also learned that many patrons of the Last Dregs Cafe are copies made by the Omicron specifically to patronize the establishment. So now we are 3 times removed from the originals, as a memory-born being gives rise to a copy of a being formed from a memory. This strikes me as a bad idea. In the digital format, a copy is a copy, almost identical in format to the original. But it's not exact. And in a universe that falls towards entropy, there will always be change, some difference. Have you ever seen Multiplicity? In that movie, Michael Keaton clones himself several times over. It all goes well until one of his clones makes a clone of himself. And, well, he's special. But it goes back to what this game says versus what it does. If the Dynamis entities in Ultima Thule are life, then the Omicrons have established that they can not only create fully formed life on a whim, but imbue it with will. To me, this is a terrifying concept, because it further devalues life in the game. What's wrong with killing someone if you can instantly remake that person in less time than it took to kill them? It utterly eliminates the consequence of death, at least if you're made of Dynamis. We saw something similar in Elpis with the ancient mentality of, I made this, so it's my property, and if I choose to destroy it, I can just make another. Paired with the tangible immortal soul in the game, it makes murder in the world of Final Fantasy XIV almost trivial. There's no consequence to it. The soul will be reborn, leaving the core of the person intact. And if the body can be remade as well, then was there even really a murder? We aren't quite sure at this point since, Dynamis, but we aren't too far off either. If the entities in Ultima Thule were made of ether though, that would be a problem. But now to the core of the matter. Are they alive? Jammingway argues that because Dynamis is being affected and Elysium exists, that proves that they are alive. But I disagree. You see, Dynamis requires a source in order to react. Currently, each time we've seen Elysium expand, the Warrior of Light has been in Ultima Thule at the time. We, carrying the hopes of now 3 worlds, the Fractured Source, the First, and the Ancient World, cannot help but impact the ambient Dynamis. And having visited shades of all the worlds as they ended, we could easily imagine how they might have looked when they were pristine. Yes, the gaps are filled in by the entities, but we provide the framework, and honestly, we have no way of knowing that that is how things actually were on their world. Perhaps it's simply an imagined paradise and a group of people dreaming about the same imaginary place. Despite that, it was wonderful to see a piece of their world not lost to death and despair. But if these are creatures made of Dynamis, what would happen to them if the ambient emotion were to turn against them? If despair once again grips their environment, how would it affect them? Are they simply to be happy for all of eternity or die? That leads down the same path that the Nibirum walked, and it goes against the theme of balance in the game. That aside, the dilemma of a different form of life is hardly a new one. As an avid fan of Star Trek, this issue was explored pretty extensively in both the Next Generation and Voyager. For this case, however, I believe the case presented in Voyager is the most relevant. In this show, the character of the Doctor is a hologram that is activated in case of an emergency where the medical staff are unavailable. The ship is tens of thousands of light years from known space, and the ship's doctor is killed, so naturally, he's in for a long ride. The character is pre-programmed in the ship's computer, and the crew can turn him on and off at will. We also learn later that the program has been installed on every ship in the fleet to function under similar circumstances. But remember, they're just a medical program. This ties into the Next Generation episode, The Measure of a Man, where Starfleet is trying to take possession of Data in order to replicate the technology that made him.
You don't have to think about their welfare. You don't think about how they feel. Whole generations of disposable people.
Picard argues that what this would achieve would in effect be creating a slave race. While Starfleet loses the case to take possession of Data, the matter of whether he is actually alive is never really answered and left for the viewer to decide. Back in Voyager, we see the scenario play out. The holograms, minus the one on Voyager, are decommissioned from ship duty. Determined to be unpleasant and unhelpful in many cases, they are moved to an asteroid mine and forced to mine dilithium as slaves. All but the Doctor on Voyager. Had they been closer to home, though, it's almost certain that he would have joined their fate. After all, in the eyes of the law, they're just projections of light and force field controlled by a computer program, easily replaceable, and can be copied and created at will. But as we spend time with the character of the Doctor, we see him develop and grow, and eventually do come to think of him as being alive, despite the text of Federation law offering him no legal protections. At one point, though, the crew encounters another race of beings that are actually holograms, as they refer to themselves photonic life. These photonic aliens don't consider creatures of matter to be truly alive, and the Doctor is the only one they acknowledge as true life. It must have been truly terrifying from their perspective to encounter a race of creatures that can create life and entire worlds on a whim, and destroy them as easily as flipping a switch and turning them off. It's rather reminiscent of the ancients in Elpis, really, but also very applicable to the situation we encounter in Ultima Thule. While Medion stores the memories of the dead races in Ultima Thule, it's not until we arrive that they are given corporeal form. There, in the farthest reaches of space, it was our emotions and our will to survive that gave them form along with the environment. So it's reasonable to assume that if powerful emotions can give form to the Dynamis affected by ambient memories, then it can also unform or malform it. A flood of suffering or despair could twist the beings there in the same way Aether can twist beings into abominations such as Voidsent or Light Wardens. With enough intention and control over Aether, one could simply break a being into its base ethereal energy. But this requires specific intention. Dynamis, on the other hand, would be extremely chaotic in comparison, using the power of emotions which would run wild were one not in complete control over their own emotions, transforming the world around them and themselves into a nightmare. A feedback loop which would breed further fear and panic, which would eventually tear everything apart. Hey, that sounds a bit like the final days. The entities in Ultima Thule are copies of the life that once actually existed. They were formed from nothing, and one day they will return to nothing. One day, Amarot too will fade from existence. We know this. Rahatia tells us this at the end of Shadowbringers. Just like one day, the Dynamis in Ultima Thule will disperse, along with all that we have achieved there. But that's really the point of Ultima Thule. Yes, eventually everything there will fade away, just how eventually everything dies, including the universe. Long after the heat death of the universe, trillions of years after the last star has gone out, there's a hypothesis that even the very protons that make up atoms will eventually disintegrate into nothing and leave only radiation behind. Eventually, everything in the universe will fade into nothingness. Even black holes as they light up the dark universe in cataclysmic explosions as they one day release all their energy and evaporate. Absolutely nothing will be left, and no life will be left to remember anything or anyone that once lived. Nothing lasts forever, not even time in the end. But it doesn't matter, none of it, because it's not about the end. Everything ends the same way. Life, stars, the universe, the very atoms that make up our reality. It's about the journey, experiencing what we can while we are here, and seizing this moment. Unlike the majority of shades in Amarot, the beings in Ultima Thule are aware of themselves and what they are, thanks to Medion's final song. Ultimately, though, it doesn't matter if the entities in Ultima Thule are actually alive or just copies of copies running a program. While they exist, they can experience life and grow. They get a second chance to be a part of the journey, and second chances are something that life does not give very often.